The Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson. Hello and welcome to History Jackson, the home of accessible and digestible history. And welcome to our Chalke History Festival special series, where we'll be talking to some of the historians, living historians and performers here at Chalke about what they're doing at the festival and their work. Now, Chalke History Festival will be covered comprehensively through History Jackson, be it on our social media, our blog, and our podcast. So if you wanted to check out more and learn more about what's happening at Chalke, do head to the links in the description below. Now, without further ado, I'll leave you to our Chalke History Festival special series episode.
Hello and welcome to our Chalke History special series on the History of Jackson podcast. Obviously, I'm not Jackson, I'm Abigail Rebecca, but more importantly, I am with the illustrious Saul David, an incredible author and historian. How are you doing today?
Very good. I mean, when I arrived this morning, it wasn't the most beautiful weather. I had a first talk with a sports journalist, actually, telling this amazing story about the Second World War, which I'd never heard about. And given that I'm a Second World War historian, you might have thought I should be a little bit embarrassed about that. But anyway, it just shows you history. There's always something new to find out about. But that's the easy bit. The tougher bit is giving your own talk. So I've done a bit of both today.
Well, I was going to say, Jonathan Wilson that you were in conversation with, and he made a really good point about the propaganda about the Soviet Union using Dynamo Kiev. So I'm not surprised that we've not really heard of it, because it was full of propaganda. Yeah,
I mean, it's one of those stories that Jonathan was far too honest in my opinion. You know, what I mean by that is that he said, well, of course we don't really know, and he was asked various questions from the audience, and the questions were along the lines of, you know, is it accurate, XYZ happened, and can we be sure? And Jonathan's too honest a journalist and author of non-fiction to really let the story flow without caveating it a lot. And I have to confess, the more I write history, the more I realise that the audience want you to make that judgment. They don't necessarily want to be told, well, it could be this, it could be that. Because if you end up writing history like that, everyone said, well, what really happened? And so you make a judgment based on your experience, on your research, on your cross-referencing. And that's really what history is in the end. And if there's too much, well, we're not entirely sure, and the sources, you end up not giving the audience a strong enough pointer for them to enjoy the story and say, great, this is what really happened. And I can almost feel myself there. And that's the fine balance, really, that we're always trying to make as historians.
Well, I have to say, you did it perfectly in your talk, because me and my colleagues were both left after your talk we were just in awe of what you had to say, because I had not really heard about the Airborne divisions of D-Day. So kind of speaking to that, how did you decide to research the Red Devils and the Airborne divisions for D-Day in particular, but throughout the Second World War?
I mean, I'd written the story of the SBS, who the special, what is now the Special Boat Service, and their forerunners were these kind of small amphibious special units that prepared D-Day, and they did a different type of job. But I'd already got into the habit of seeing the whole of the Second World War through the prism of a small, well-trained unit. And the question is always asked in these occasions, and I try to answer a little bit in the talk, is, you know, was the time and effort and energy and endless infighting that goes into the creation of any new military organization worth it in terms of what they actually achieved? And in both the case of the SBS and also Sky Warriors, who are British Airborne, the answer is yes, but you have to justify that. You have to sort of explain why. And I think the story of D-Day is told, I would say this, but I think it's true, it's told too much from this perspective of ships coming in and everyone landing on the beaches. And of course that's tremendously important, because if you don't get all those guys on the beaches and the tanks and all the support material and the endless building of the artificial harbours, and there are so many facets to D-Day. But a really, really crucial bit of the story is that if the beaches aren't secure in the first place, they're all going to be driven off. And the Germans are absolute masters at counter-attacking a situation when they know there's a threat. That's what they're trained for. You know, their whole military doctrine demands it. So arguably the single most important job of D-Day is to protect the beaches, so that all those guys coming in are in an environment in which they're not going to be counterattacked literally as they get off the ships. And the German knew the attack was going to come eventually, and their response to that is, when it comes, we're going to drive them off the beaches. So the Brits knew that, and the story of Airborne is it's a story that not everyone's missed, but I think in the kind of, you stop a man in the street and say what was important about D-Day, and they might argue, well, getting off the beaches and clearing the beaches and driving inland, but they wouldn't say the single most dangerous job as well as important, which is airborne.
And absolutely paramount to be able to give the defence and support that was needed to make the amphibian mission successful.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, what you get in all military operations is it's a lot of interlocking stories. But if you miss out one story, I mean, I gave an example when I was talking today about Pegasus Bridge, which is one of the most famous airborne operations. You capture the bridge, you hold it, and that stops the enemy armour, panzers, coming the other direction and getting at the beaches. So that's reasonably straightforward to understand. But even within that relatively encapsulated story, you get the nuance of, well, who actually does the defending of the bridge? And most people who know about the bridge, and that's not everyone, as you've already explained, will think, well, okay, the company that arrived there, that were given the initial job. And what I tried to explain in the talk today is, yes, they've got most of the credit, but also someone else is. So you've got the kind of double story where you're saying not only are airborne missed out a little bit, but even the bits of the airborne story that are well known, we don't always give credit where it's due. And I think, one of our jobs as historians, when we're trying to redress the balance a little bit of what the public already know or what people have already written about, is to fill in the gaps. Who else deserves some credit? Because I think I spoke to a couple of families of veterans today. It's interesting how many people in the queue when I was signing books have airborne connections.
Wow, that's really incredible.
And so someone's dad was at the story I was talking about at Pegasus Bridge, and I asked her the question, did she feel, he was a member of 7 Para, which is the unit came in later to defend the bridge, and I said, did your father feel that he was given due credit? And she said, not really. And it's it's really sad to hear that, but in any case, my job as a historian, the way I see it, is to redress the balance for people like her and her family and that unit and all the relatives and people involved in that, so that they do get a little bit of the credit for what was let's all face it, we've just celebrated the 80th anniversary, one of the most extraordinary, courageous but important military operations in history.
Of course, and it also brings that human element back. So to actually say these are the lives of real people, not just a mass of people who are washed ashore. But You mentioned in your talk that Churchill kind of saw the airbornes as a grand experiment, and with any experiment there are teething issues. How did they negate these issues to protect human life? Because with any experiment there is going to be cost, but we don't want that to be at the expense of our troops.
Yeah, and I'd love to say that they were very successful in mitigating the cost. One of the people who reviewed my book was James Holland, and James, of course, is the reason we're all standing here in this fabulous festival. I mean, this is James Holland territory. In fact, this is Holland territory. So he was born and brought up, as you know, in the Chalke Valley. And when James reviewed the book, he said one of the tragedies of this story, he's very generous about the book, but he said one of the tragedies of the story are how many lives were sacrificed because errors were made and planning was bad. So although I told the story today of one of the most successful and glorious airborne operations of the Second World War, there were many other stories where things didn't go to plan. So I'd love to be able to say they were very good at mitigating it. I think by the end, by 1945, they'd sort of learned. It's a long, slow and steep learning curve.
I can imagine.
I remember my editor saying to me, she said, you need to be able to knit these stories together so that the reader can feel that they're going forward, that things are progressing. But it's not always, up a ladder. It's snakes and ladders. And really, yes, you end up at the peak, but there are so many dips along the way. And that is, well, first of all, that's war, where the unexpected is the norm. But it's also the typical business of when you're trying something new. And a lot of people who are involved in a military organisation don't like novelty. They like, this is the way we've always done it. And airborne hadn't existed in the British Army before the Second World War. So it was very much a question of convincing people that to take the best of the best and put them in this unit and train them and then use them, and obviously a lot of lives are lost in the course of fighting these important airborne operations, that all of that is justified.
Of course. And you discussed the peaks and the not so upward progression to success that we saw with Major Howard, with the 6th Division. What would you say in all your research, and this is probably a hard question to answer, but what would you say stuck out to you as the most influential part of making that a success, making the Airborne a successful experiment overall?
Well, they needed moments along the way to convince the doubters. When I say they, the people who were keen supporters of Airborne. So that's Churchill to begin with. But then within the Airborne organisation, you've got a lot of key people. Boyd Browning, who's often blamed for the disaster of Arnhem, but is very important in the story because he sees the possibility of using airborne troops not just as raiders that you would drop behind enemy lines to blow up a bridge or an aqueduct or steal a radar. And Max Hastings was talking earlier about the stealing of radar, which was a very successful operation, but he saw it in much bigger terms, that you can eventually use airborne in a strategic role, which means that you can drop them, a lot of them, behind enemy lines in coordination with the ground offensive, so that ultimately they can make a real difference. I mean, they can be a battlefield winner, they can be a campaign winner even. And obviously the biggest and most important campaign of all is D-Day, because if we can't get ashore on Fortress Europe, we're not going to get it. So you needed along the way a certain number of moments where you could say, it's not perfect yet, but I think we can get there. Having said all of that, to have Churchill, who after all was Prime Minister for 5 years, the most important 5 years of the war, from 1940 to the end of the war, as an absolutely stoical, determined supporter of Airborne, and in the end able to say to his military chiefs, it's going to happen because I say it's going to happen. I think that does make a big difference. But it was necessary, but it was also true that there were lots of moments along the way where the airborne experiment could have failed. And it was thanks to Churchill, people like Browning, Rock and Frost and all the other pioneers, but also there were enough successes along the way to give them enough time to put together what was the sort of crown jewel of the story of Airborne in the Second World War, which was D-Day. You know, what's at stake? The future of Western civilization, and we managed to pull it off.
Yeah, truly incredible. But so looking to kind of more contemporary Airborne now, are there any major differences between the airborne that were successful during World War II and the airborne troops in the British Army that we are seeing today training in exercises in Estonia, for example?
Yeah. Well, I mean, funny enough, I was talking to some people recently, ex-paras who went on to join the SAS. So a lot of paras, a lot of sky warriors, as I call them in my book.
It's a very apt name for them.
I know. So, by the way, my original title was stolen. I thought, okay, what am I going to do? But I think it's a better title than my original title. And you can probably guess what my original one was. But what they said today is that the legacy of the Second World War was still very much part of their modus operandi. All the basic principles of warfare, landing behind enemy lines, lightly armed, exactly the same way they're trained today. They're trained to use aggression, speed, surprise, again, all the principles that they used during the famous operation at Pegasus Bridge, because by the nature of airborne forces, they're always going to be lightly armed. They're always going to be outgunned, so they have to do everything very quickly, i.e. they have to get in, solve whatever problem they've got, and then get out. Now they've got the advantage of helicopters, so most of our airborne troops are part of what we call the 16th Air Assault Brigade, which is basically our emergency force for use anywhere in the world. And the great thing about helicopters is that they can, they're not inviolable in the sense that they are, as we can see from the Ukraine war at the moment. I mean, helicopters can be shot down by surface-to-air missiles and various other forms of military munitions. But still, as a means of getting people fast to a location, delivering, this heavy hitting power, which is airborne forces, it's a much better way of going to war than a parachute and a glider.
Yeah, especially with what you were saying in your talk about them not even being able to land a mile in proximity to the point they needed to be. But just one final question before we say goodbye and round up. You have been a veteran, for a better word, of the Chalke History Festival for the years that it has been up and running.
Yeah, I think I was here the first year. It was a
And
long
every
time.
year since?
How long ago is that, actually?
15 years, I believe.
15 years. Wow, they're
Yeah.
15 years, are they?
I
Okay.
was told that it was on a cricket ground, I think, over that hill,
Yeah.
over one of the valleys.
This was not the original location, but where they've ended up, I doubt they'll ever move. I
it's
don't know
perfect.
what their relationship is like with their landlord, but this is absolutely perfect. You know, it's not totally flat, okay, but this for Chalke Valley, which is rolling chalk land. This is just the most perfect setting. It's absolutely beautiful. And it is uncanny how often the weather is good here. I mean, maybe I'm just imagining it. I mean, this week has been absolutely beautiful.
Oh, it's been stunning, except for, I think, a little bit this morning when it rained. But the sun has come back out, so we can't ask for anything more.
No, I mean, the crowds are big. There's a sort of energy here. It's also multi-generational, so they're very good at the whole educational thing. So you'll see a lot of young people here. You get much more of a gender mix here. And I have to say, you know, obviously I speak all over the place, and it's better here than it is anywhere else. Why? Because yes, I'm here talking about military history, but of course people are here for history per se. And it's just great to see history so popular. I mean, it's extraordinary. This started out as a tiny little festival, and look at it now. I don't know how many people come through it, but it's in the tens of thousands, I'm
It
guessing.
has to be. But I like the point you said about the gender equality and not so divided, because that's one thing that I've noticed that Chalke does incredibly, the vast difference in content on the programme. We go from Tudors to World War, all the way. We've got a living historian who's performing samurai over here, and then we've got stonemasons to our left
It's
here.
just nuts, isn't it?
It's nuts. There is something here for every single person and every single niche interest. If you could pinpoint one thing, be it a talk from 15 years ago or something from our festival this week, what's been your favourite thing?
Yeah, I mean, I spoke about, I think one of my earliest talks was on one of my favourite books, actually. So I wrote a book many years ago called Zulu, and Zulu was about the Zulu War of 1879, and, you know, you get the set-piece famous battles of Islamwana and Rorke's Drift. And the talk I gave, and the most important part of the book is to explain to people in a counterintuitive way that actually those two battles took place on the same day. Now, they're made into two feature films, okay? Most people remember Zulu, but they don't remember the other one, which is Zulu Dawn. The point is, Zulu Dawn, which is Islamwana, happens the day before Rorke's Drift. So in any case, going back to your question, when I gave that talk, it was like I could see all these slack jaws, and people were astonished to be told a very simple fact, which is you've seen the two films and you never put them together. And that is just a classic thing about history. And so you, as a historian, of course, you're obviously you want to sell books so you can keep being a historian. But the most fun is when you're talking live, because you get this immediate reaction. And so that's just a very small point. Obviously, the book's much bigger than that. But I just remember feeling what a kind of, you know, wonderfully kind of vibrant and energetic place Chalke is. And, you know, long may it last, because you never quite know with festivals. We've had a lot of, you know, bad stuff this year about the funding of festivals. And, you know, so far, Chalke seems to have survived that storm. But, you know, we need literary festivals, because talk to any author, you know, most of us love them.
100%, but they're also such a good way to clear up misconceptions and to challenge perceptions in a way that people are receptive to, and it isn't going to cause this big debate. Yeah,
well, I mean, the beauty of history is it's contested. I mean, no honest historian who writes a history book, there are obviously some exceptions, but no one being truly honest would ever say that's the last word. What they should be saying is this is my best impression, almost my best guess, based on the information I've seen, my own experience, my own knowledge. And here I am. I'm giving you a vision of the past that is imperfect, but you know, you hope it's going to be compelling, and you hope that they take it in the way that they should, which is that this is fascinating, it's interesting. I trust Saul; he's done his research, but this is not the last word. And if I was interested in being a historian, that's the reader, not me personally, I maybe could improve on this one day. And I would never, you know, think, oh my God, you know, how arrogant to think you could do better than the great Saul David. You know, that's history. That's what happens. It just gets improved by every generation.
Yeah. And inspiring generations is what Chalke does.
With the youth there, exactly.
So on that note, I want to say thank you for coming onto our podcast. And where can people go and buy your many books? Speaking of plugging books at literary festivals?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. I mean, if you were anywhere near the festival, of course, you could just go to the Waterston's tent behind me. But any good bookshop, but also everything's available online now. I mean, there really isn't an excuse to buy books anymore. So you just got to put my name in, hopefully the name of my latest book, and you'll be able to get it easily.
And can people interact with you online on social media?
Yeah, I'm on. I wish I could say I'm more active. I am on Twitter, so I'm Saul David 66, which is the year of my birth. And I know you think, God, you don't look that old. You'd be absolutely. No, I'm joking.
No,
Saul
that is
David
what me and my colleagues said. We were like, "There's no way." We were like, "You look so young." We genuinely thought, "We're in the right tent."
Yeah, there is a habit about some people I've noticed. Okay, if you don't get your name as a handle, and obviously I started too late. I've been on Twitter since 2010 actually, but anyway, later than some. You tend to add a couple of letters or numbers you're not going to forget. So I chose my birth year.
Makes sense. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I know our listeners are going to enjoy listening to this episode. And thank you.